everyone. In this video, I'm going to be breaking down an indie comic called The Good Asian. This book was very critically acclaimed this year. It got nominated for an Eisner, which is like the Oscars for comic books. Got nominated for an Eisner for Best Limited Series from this year. And that is what put it on my radar. I was looking for some interesting books to showcase to you all, so I read through a whole bunch of Eisner-nominated books, and this one really caught my eye. It is a really interesting, cool, crime noir pulp story. It's about an Asian American detective in the 1930s. He's called to San Francisco, and he is working on a missing persons case. So I really love the crime noir aspects of it, and the artwork, and the overall kind of design and aesthetic of the book. Also, what's interesting is that this book really layers on some historical context. So because it is starring an Asian American character in a time in the 1930s when America was very racist, it's very interesting to explore some of that Asian American experience within this book. And this book actually employed a historical consultant for the creative team, so there's a lot of history explored in here. So with all that being said, let's dive into the story, and I'll give a paraphrased, summarized version of the story. And I will be doing Volume 1 in this video, and next week I will be back with Volume 2, which will be the conclusion. So let's dive into it. The Good Asian, written by Pornsak, Pichetshote, and art by Alexandre, Tefenkgi. Before I dive into the story, let's do a little character breakdown and give some historical context. So, this book is set in 1936, and the world was a very different time back then, especially for people of Chinese descent in America. Our main character is named Edison Hark. His mom and dad were originally from China, and they immigrated and lived in Hawaii. And there they conceived and gave birth to Edison, thereby making Edison a Hawaiian-born American citizen. Edison's father gambled away their money, and when the people who he owed money to came to collect their debt, Edison's father decided to abandon his family and he went back to China. Edison and his mom would have been on the hook for their father's debt and been unable to pay. Luckily, a rich millionaire named Mason Carraway took pity on Edison's mom and gave her a job as his maid. Edison's mom greatly appreciated it, and she became a beloved Carraway employee, and she grew close to Mason and his family. And Edison, he would actually play with Mason's children growing up. When Edison was 10 years old, his mother was murdered by a burglar named Michael Martinez. There were no clues and the police had no suspects, and Michael would have gotten away with it, as the police were not going to work that hard to solve the crime of an Oriental woman. But Mason Carraway, with his money and influence, rose bloody hell, and eventually Michael was caught and apprehended and hanged. Mason Carraway then told 10-year-old Edison Hark, "After everything she did for us, if anything ever happened, I promised to your mother, Edison, that I would raise you like you were my own." Mason Carraway, he took Edison in, and he became a surrogate father to him. Mason's other children were Frankie Carraway and Victoria Carraway, and they would, in many ways, sort of become like siblings to Edison. Edison, he was raised right along with them, and they all became a family. At first, the Carraways lived in Hawaii, and they kind of split their time between Hawaii and San Francisco. Eventually, Mason and Frankie and Victoria, they more permanently moved down to San Francisco and ran their various businesses there. But Edison, he stayed in Hawaii. And when Edison grew up, he became a police officer, one of the first Chinese police officers in America at the time. In mainland America, in San Francisco in 1936, the Carraways have been living there for many years at that point. Mason Carraway, he fell in love with a 25-year-old Chinese maid who lived upstairs named Ivy Chen. Their feelings were supposedly mutual, but the two never acted on them, as Ivy worried how people would judge her, and Mason, he respected her wishes. At some point, Mason and Ivy had a loud argument, and Ivy left, and she disappeared. Mason had the cops and his own special private investigators try and find Ivy, but they could not track her down. And the shock of her going missing broke Mason's heart in a figurative sense, but also a literal one. And Mason had a heart attack, and it threw him into a coma. Mason's son, Frankie, hoped that Ivy's return might restore his father's health. The people that have been working the case trying to find Ivy Chen have come up empty-handed. But then Frankie thought of his adoptive brother, Edison Hark. He's a detective and he's Chinese. He could maybe sniff out leads that his American counterparts could not. So Frankie sent a telegram to Hawaii to Edison Hark and told him to come to San Francisco and see if he could help. Alright, now those are our major characters that we're going to need to know before we dive into the story. But it is also important to know some historical context at the time. So this book is set in 1936. But first, let's make our way there. Now, one of the major themes explored in this book is the Asian American experience and racism and what life was like for people of Asian descent back then in America in the 30s. Back in 1850, Chinese immigration into America surged with jobs in mining and railroad construction and the gold rush in California. Some Americans were upset that these new Chinese immigrants were driving down the wages of hardworking Americans. In 1854, the California Supreme Court ruled that people of Asian descent could not testify against a white person in court. So a white person could beat up an Asian person, and the white person would not have to face any repercussions from anti-Asian violence. Politicians at the time openly campaigned on anti-Chinese platforms, and there were anti-Chinese protests as well. In 1882, the US passed a law called the Chinese Exclusion Act. This law banned all Chinese coming into America with the exception of diplomats, students, teachers, and merchants. The Chinese would begin entering America illegally for work. They would travel to Canada or Mexico and then sneak into America. Some immigrants, though, they actually did have legal paperwork, and they would try and come into America legally, and they would have to be processed. Just as immigrants crossing the Atlantic went to Ellis Island in New York, immigrants crossing the Pacific came through Angel Island in San Francisco. Whereas Ellis Island travelers spent anywhere from a few hours to a few days there, Asian travelers traveling through Angel Island, well, they could spend anywhere from days to years detained, waiting for their paperwork to be processed. Americans would subject immigrants to questions, sometimes over 100 questions, and sometimes covering very minute detail. Questions like, how many windows are in your house? What kind of feet does your wife have, bound or not? And these questions would then be cross-checked against testimony of their family, and maybe a family member who already lived in America, for instance. And the questions were designed to sort of weed out those with fake papers. So with all of that historical context, let's begin our story now, The Good Asian. We begin in 1936 in San Francisco. Edison Hark, a police officer, was called by his adoptive brother Frankie Carraway to see if he could track down his father's love interest Ivy Chen, the 25-year-old Chinese maid who lived upstairs. Even though Edison had legal paperwork and he was born in America, he was still detained when he traveled from Hawaii to San Francisco. And Edison has actually been detained there for 10 days. One person he met in the processing center was a 12-year-old boy named Kai. Kai's father lived in Los Angeles and his mother lived in China. Kai's father at some point got sick in LA, and the wife of a Chinese immigrant is not allowed to enter the country, so little 12-year-old Kai was sent. And Kai has been stuck in this immigrant processing center for 2 months. Edison and Kai talked, and Kai asked if Edison thought he would be allowed into America. Edison answered the boy, "I don't know, but they sent you because they thought America was fair. So you traveled 30 days and you've been stuck here 60 more where the food's gray and the water's brown, for no better reason than because the people you loved asked you to. If America can't find room for that, then it's shown you what it is. Whatever happens next, don't fool yourself into thinking it'll change." Some white men eventually come in and find Edison. Edison's brother Frankie Carraway pulled some strings and finally got Edison processed so he can get out of there. Now that Edison is here in San Francisco, he can now get to work trying to track down this Ivy Chen. The next day, thanks to Frankie's connections, Edison was allowed to tag along with an American detective named Detective O'Malley. Detective O'Malley is a hard-drinking, racist, old-school Irish-American cop, and he works for San Francisco's Chinatown squad. He's got a fancy suit, but he bought it years ago, and now it has mustard stains all over it, and he's kind of stopped caring. Apparently, a decade ago, O'Malley's son died by overdosing in a dope den, and ever since then, O'Malley has kind of changed. Edison and O'Malley are at a home of a family that owns a mahjong parlor in San Francisco's Chinatown. This mahjong parlor was one that Ivy Chen's mother apparently used to work at before she died, and supposedly Ivy was seen there recently. Edison and O'Malley are thinking maybe they can get some info on her here. Detective O'Malley is asking questions. He asks the family, "What do you know about a Chinese maid named Ivy Chen?" No one in the room is talking. The mother and father are just watching as Detective O'Malley starts getting rough with their son Tony. O'Malley, he is dropping colorful slurs at the whole family. He's threatening to deport them if they don't talk. Edison the whole time, he's just hanging out at the back of the room. He's smoking a cigarette and he has his trench coat on and looking oh so crime noir. Edison, using his keen detective perception skills, notices some marks on the father's arm, and eventually Edison tells O'Malley, "The old man's hooked on dope. Check the scratch marks on his arm. His stash is in the flower pot on the mantel. Ain't that right, Pops?" The father in the room, nervous that they are going to find his drug stash, he begins booking it out of the room and he's trying to escape. O'Malley, he is still holding down the younger one named Tony. So it's up to Edison to pursue the father that is running away. Edison, he's running and he grabs an iron that is on an ironing board in the room, and then he heads out into the hallway. The father has already ran down one floor and is circling the next, and Edison, from the floor above, he throws the iron, and he nails the dad right in the back, taking him down. That would actually really hurt if someone threw a metal iron at you from a floor up above. With the father now down, Edison turns his attention to the son and the mother, and he flashes his badge. The son and mother are confused. They've never seen a Chinese cop before. The son, Tony, he calls Edison a sellout in a way. Edison tells the son, "Look at your mom. Your pop was gonna let her and you get arrested for hiding his dope. So guess what? You wanna know when they stop treating us Chinese like dirt here in America? What's when we stop giving them goddamn reasons to." Edison, he eventually managed to get some information he needed out of the family. And the dad with the drugs eventually got arrested and hauled into jail for possession. Edison, he then goes on to visit his adoptive brother Frankie Carraway and his father Mason Carraway, who is lying in a bed in a coma. Even though Mason is in a coma and can't hear them, Edison and Frankie talk to him anyway, and they figure maybe by talking to him it will help. Eventually, Edison and Frankie discuss Ivy Chen and where she might be. Edison reports that the old lady from the Mahjong parlor, whom he was just questioning, well, she didn't see Ivy for months apparently, but she did see Ivy the day before Ivy disappeared. And she remembered Ivy commenting on how she saw a sunrise right before getting there, even though Ivy got there around 5 p.m. or so. So Edison's not sure how she saw a sunrise at that time. Edison, he notices a painting on the wall in the room and he comments, "You guys still have it." The painting is of Mason with Frankie, Edison, and Victoria, their whole family. Frankie replies, "Of course, it's Father's favorite painting. He always said the day we posed for it, we became a family." Edison remembers Victoria, his sister, being mean to him in the beginning. There is a memory that replays in his mind of Victoria saying to him, "You're not my brother. You're just trash Father gave a home." Victoria Carraway, the youngest sibling, hasn't seen Edison since they were young, and in some ways seems that she doesn't want to. Frankie, he remembers something that may help. Ivy used to live at 725 Grant Street, and there is a mural of a sunrise painted on the building across from it. Ivy used to say how much she loved it. Edison thinks that this is a pretty good lead to follow. He will check it out. Edison, he is driving across town, heading to 725 Grant Street. As he arrives, he sees there is a police raid happening at 527 Grant Street, which is the exact reverse address to where he is headed. If you took the 5 and 7 and flipped them, Edison decides to stop and check out the commotion. The police raid was maybe meant to go to the address that he is headed to. The police, though, they are doing their raid here, and they are looking for a mysterious killer named Hui Long. Hui was a urban legend. 30 years ago, Hui Long was a hatchet man no one could prove existed, and he belonged to a gang called the Tong. He was a boogeyman who massacred the families of the Tong's rivals. Eventually, though, he was betrayed and ran off, but Hui Long promised to unleash his wrath on his betrayers and their descendants. About a decade ago, the Tong gang had supposedly been run out of Chinatown, but a month ago, the grandson of the Tong's ex-president was found dead, with his eyeballs scooped out, and instantly rumors of Hui Long's return began spreading. Edison, he overhears the cops at the raid talk about how this is all Detective O'Malley's doing, and O'Malley had some sort of lead that Hui Long had returned and could be found here. All the cops, they are harassing the locals trying to get information, but it doesn't seem like they are getting anywhere. Edison, as he is stopping to watch all this commotion, he sees some white woman walk by in sexy outfits. Even though Edison is Chinese, he can't help himself. He has a thing for white women. He studies the woman's curves and lips and breasts, and he smirks, and then he leaves. Edison, he drives to 725 Grant Street, and sure enough, he sees that painted sunrise mural on the building that his brother Frankie mentioned. As Edison is there, he sees a little kid sitting on a stoop. Edison shows his badge to the kid. He asks the boy if everything is okay. The boy is a little uneasy, but he trusts Edison, and he brings Edison to a closed-down storefront that is unlocked. Edison notices that it is unlocked, which he finds strange. In this neighborhood, nobody leaves a door like that unlocked unless they want someone to come in. So somebody wants someone to go into this building. The two of them head down the stairs to the storefront, and inside, they find a dead body. The dead body is of a white man, and he looks like he died a few days ago. He has a hatchet in his chest, and his eyes were gouged out. Killing in this way is apparently the calling card of this mysterious Tong urban legend killer named Hui Long, the one that Detective O'Malley was looking for. Edison and the boy are back on the street now. The boy admits that they found the body a few days ago, but they didn't tell anyone because his papa said that they would get blamed. There is some truth to this. The cops might try to pin the murder on the boy and his father. And even if the cops didn't pin the murder on them, the cops might still crack down hard on the Chinese community, as they would believe that this Tong gang killer is back in action. Edison, he tells the boy to go home right now. The boy is crying a little bit and confused. He asks, "But I didn't do anything. You said you're a cop. You can protect us." All of a sudden, Detective O'Malley, he shows up. He saw Edison drive by his scene he was at earlier, and he followed him. O'Malley asks, "You want to tell me why the squirt needs protection from? The tongs, maybe?" O'Malley, he grabs the kid by his hand, and he begins yelling at him, saying, "I'll kick your stinking family out of the country, lest you spill. What are you hiding?" Edison, he is watching, and he is worried. What might happen if O'Malley discovers that body? Should he step in? What should he do? How should he play this? Issue 2. The boy and his father were brought in for questioning, but eventually they were cleared of the murder. The cops do not believe that they did it. The father, he was out of town when the murder took place. Edison, he was brought into jail as well, but he was also released. O'Malley, talking to Edison as Edison is leaving the police station, says, "Hey, Detective Ching Chong, next time the Caraways ain't protecting you." As Edison leaves, he is met by his brother Frankie, as well as a man named Terrence Chang. Terrence shakes Edison's hand. Terrence, he works for a group called the 6 Companies. The 6 Companies is an organization made up of 6 regional groups working together on behalf of Chinese immigrants, acting as Chinatown's equivalent to a government. Terrence Chang, he is a lawyer. He helped and made sure the boy and his father didn't admit to something that they didn't do. Frankie, Edison, and Terrence, they all go to lunch. Terrence, he is a successful lawyer and pillar of the Chinatown community in San Francisco. He also has various business interests in the city. Terrence, he strives to be perfect. He is Chinatown's great yellow hope. He tries to set an example to the community, and he dreams that one day the Americans will look at the Chinese in America and just see them as qualified citizens. Edison is talking to Terrence about the police raid he saw the other day, and any information on that dead body he found. Terrence explains that Detective O'Malley, he arrested an opium addict the other day, and the addict gave him a lead on a dead body. But the addict reversed the digits accidentally and said 527 when he meant to say 725. The dead body that Edison found at the correct address was a man named Alan Archer. Alan was an ex-con who betrayed Hui Long back in the day, and that is why the police believe this Hui Long is back in operation, because there are now 2 murders associated potentially with him. Frankie is a little confused because he never heard of this Hui Long taking people's eyeballs in the past. That seems kind of new. Terrence Chang is upset about all of this talk about Hui Long. He doesn't even believe that Hui Long is real and that he's actually come back. He argues there's no such thing as Hui Long. But slave girls and underground tunnels and missing eyes? If you die in Chinatown, of course that's involved. No, the real problem's the timing in all of this. People in Washington are starting to be more sympathetic about the struggle of the American Chinese, and hearing that the Tong gang and Hui Long may be back in operation could ruin everything. Terrence asks for Edison's help in solving this Hui Long case and finding out who really murdered this Alan Archer. If Edison solves this Huilong case, everyone can just put all this nonsense behind them, and it will no longer delay the progress of the American Chinese. Edison is not interested in helping, though. He has his own worries to take care of. Edison, he heads back to his flat that his brother Frankie is renting for him while he works here in San Francisco. Edison, he is mulling over the Ivy Chen case. Where could she have gone? Edison, he checks a few places that maybe some white cops might have neglected to check out. He goes to a herbalist shop. He checks out a grocery store and some vans. In these vans, Ivy might have been able to grab a ride out of town to LA or Oakland too. So far, though, Edison is having no luck and not getting any leads. Eventually, though, Edison checks out the Mahjong parlor, the one that Ivy Chen's mom used to work at before she died, and the one that Ivy was supposedly at the day before she disappeared. Edison is talking to one of the regular patrons in the parlor, and that patron says that he hasn't seen Ivy for a while. Ivy's mom used to bring Ivy around when Ivy was a little girl, but then Ivy grew up, and Ivy supposedly moved out of town and she visited less often. And there were also rumors that Ivy was more interested in wrapping rich white men around her fingers and using them to buy her stuff. In modern times, I think we would call her a sugar baby, but these are just rumors. They might not be true. After Ivy's mom died, the patron assumed that he would never see Ivy again. But a month ago, Ivy came back and she looked scared. And this was supposedly the day before she went missing. The patron, he says that Ivy had a stamp on her hand, and the stamp was for a nightclub called the Jade Castle. Edison, he thanks the man for the information. He is going to check out this Jade Castle and see if he can get any leads there. Edison, he heads over to that Jade Castle to investigate, and as he enters the Jade Castle Club, he sees all sorts of commotion going on. The Jade Castle is a club that features all Chinese performers, a mix of singers, dancers, acrobats, and musicians. Often the Chinese woman in the show would be stripping and dancing sexually. This kind of place appeals to the Chinese customers in the area, but also some white customers who find the whole thing very exotic. As Edison is walking around the club, the owners of the club are standing on a stage, and they are thanking everyone for joining them that night. The owners of the Jade Castle are brothers named Benny and Donnie Yan. In addition to them, though, the Carraway family, as well as that lawyer Terrence Chang we met earlier, they are also investors in the club. Edison, he actually sees his adoptive sister Victoria Carraway in the club, and he is surprised to see her. He says, "Hello, Victoria." She is still a little cold to Edison. Edison asks her what she is doing here. She says that since the Carraways have invested in this club, she is here to overlook their investment. Victoria tells Edison, "And I hear you're back at Frankie's beck and call? Well, I believe he's over there helping everyone celebrate his friend, Terrence." She points to Terrence Chang, sitting at a table, and Edison's brother Frankie is there as well, celebrating Terrence. Benny Yan, one of the brothers that owns the Jade Castle, he actually comes over to the table, and he grabs Terrence and brings Terrence up on stage, and wants Terrence to say a few words to the crowd. Terrence, now standing on the stage, facing the crowd, says, "Thanks. I don't know much about clubs, but, well, I know performing takes a lifetime of training, and I know it's done because you want to stand out doing what you love, except Oriental performers stand out too much, at least from the Americans in the troupe, right? So the job goes to someone else. But here, at the Jade Castle, Oriental performers don't stand out. They stand together, beside all these beautiful white faces in the room, because that's the future. Together, we'll make America pay attention to its Chinese voices. Everyone in the crowd is eating this up and they all begin applauding. All of a sudden, though, a man in a mascot mask outfit runs up to the stage. This man may be the attacker, Hui Long, that everyone is so focused on. Hui Long appears to be trying to attack Terrence, but Benny Yan, he pushes Terrence out of the way, and Benny, he gets his throat slashed by the mysterious attacker. Then, what sounds like gunfire starts going off. In actuality, though, it's actually just some firecrackers that someone hid nearby. Either way, though, the sound of them serves as a good distraction, as the whole nightclub is panicking, assuming it's gunfire, and they all begin running for the doors. Hui Long, the attacker, is trying to make his exit now. Edison, though, is chasing after him, and he follows him into the kitchen. The attacker kicks Edison in the face. Edison is a little surprised by the move, not expecting this fighter to be a kicker. Hui Long must know some sort of martial arts, maybe. Edison, he throws some punches at the attacker, but the attacker does some dodges and flips and cartwheels back. And then the attacker pulls out a hatchet and tosses it at Edison. And the hatchet sticks into Edison's shoulder and cuts him. And Edison falls down. And this mysterious attacker manages to get out of the building and then escape into the night. Edison eventually removes that hatchet from his shoulder and he heads outside, but of course the attacker is now long gone. Edison's sister Victoria comes outside and finds Edison. She asks him, "What are you doing? Running after a killer?" Edison says that he's doing his job. Victoria coldly to this says, "Right. Well then, have at it." Edison, then alluding to his complicated history with his sister, says, "Look, I'm sorry about everything." Victoria is not interested in her brother's sorries. She tells him to screw off and do whatever he came back for and then go back to hell. Before Victoria leaves, Edison asks Victoria, "Fine, then tell me, did Frankie have the hots for the woman his father loved, this Ivy Chen woman?" Victoria asks, "What?" Edison elaborates, "He sure recalls things about Ivy Chen like he does." Edison suspects his brother Frankie might not be fully forthright on everything he's been saying. Edison asks if Ivy was working both Mason and Frankie, father and son. Edison's thinking that Ivy is the sugar baby, potentially. Victoria tells her brother, "God, you're so sure of your tiny cynical view, aren't you? Did you ever consider the girl had good reason to run away?" Edison is confused. Victoria elaborates on her father. She says, "You never had any idea how many secrets Mason had, did you?" Edison asks, "Like what?" Victoria replies, "Name it. He's the most powerful person in any room he enters. He always knows more than he lets on about everything. Me, you, hell, even your mother's death." What is Edison's sister Victoria insinuating about Edison's mother's death? Well, that is a plot thread we will have to leave hanging for now. Issue 3. We are introduced to a new character named Lucy Fan. Lucy wants to be a singer, but for now she just plays it safe, and she works at the Chinatown telephone exchange as an operator. In the 1930s, basically, every phone call had to go through an operator, so it was a busy job. And every operator, if you worked in Chinatown, had to memorize every Chinatown address and phone number. Often the operators would gossip, and sometimes, and by sometimes I mean regularly, they would listen in on people's phone calls too. As Lucy is working, she overhears some coworkers of hers gossiping. They are talking about all the events going on, about this Hui Long killing an American, and how because of that, the Chinatown police squad tore people's doors down with axes. They talk about how, remember last year, when they thought the tongs were back, they wouldn't let anyone in or out of Chinatown. The co-workers also discussed Terrence Chang and how handsome he is and how he's single. Of course, they don't know he's secretly gay. They discuss it being dangerous on the streets and maybe they should use the buddy system when they walk home. Finally, the workday ends and Lucy Fan can leave. Lucy, she meets with Edison Hark. Edison, he got connected to Lucy by a friend of his back in Hawaii named Wilbur Manalo, who thought that Lucy could help Edison with his investigation. Lucy, working at the telephone exchange, knows Chinatown inside and out, and she will probably make a good local guide for Edison. So the two of them meet at an ice cream shop and get acquainted. Lucy has a little bit of a crush on Edison, and she's impressed that Edison made it as a police officer. After some food, they get to business. Edison explains what he's learned so far and what he's investigating. He shows Lucy a picture of Ivy Chen, who he's trying to find. Lucy, she doesn't think she can be much help, but looking at the picture of Ivy, she recognizes Ivy's dress because she owns a similar one back at home. And there's only one person in town that makes that dress, so maybe that will be a lead. The two of them head over to a woman named Miss Z. She is the dressmaker. Miss Z is apprehensive to talk to Edison as she doesn't trust police, and she knows that Edison works for the rich Caraways. But Edison, he shares the story of his mother's death, and how the Caraways were the only reason they ever found out who killed her. He manages to gain some sympathy from Miss Z, and the dressmaker tells them that Ivy Chen was best friends with a woman named Holly Chow, and maybe Holly's family would know something. Edison wonders why can't he just speak to this Holly himself, Ivy's best friend, directly. Apparently, it is because Holly died in a fire, so the family will have to do. Edison thanks Miss Z, and Miss Z, she even offers to ask around the neighborhood, see if she can find out any more information. Edison and Lucy head over to the Chow family to see if they can get some info. Holly's parents really don't want to talk to the police, so they completely shut out Edison. But Holly's sister, Helen Chow, she slips by and does give some info. Holly didn't have the best reputation on the street. She was known for stringing along rich white men and getting them to buy her stuff, and when Holly died in a fire, at some point, Helen found an envelope in one of her sister's hiding spots, and in the envelope was some money in it, as well as some camera film. Helen asks them, "Look, you can keep us out of whatever this is, right? I didn't even find the envelope until after the fire." Edison asks, "You don't know whose money, whose film this is?" Helen answers, "No, but I bet it's got to do with Ivy." Anytime Holly got into real trouble, it was because of something they hatched together. Ivy's crazy. She bragged her father was a hatchet man named Hui Long. Edison and Lucy leave. They start discussing a possible connection with Hui Long and Ivy. Ivy claimed he was her father? It's all very confusing. As they are walking the street, they get interrupted by an angry man. This angry man is Tony, the son of the guy from issue 1 who Edison threw the iron at. Remember that? Well, Tony is drunk and pissed off. And Lucy, she recognizes Tony as well. She knows him. And she tries to calm him down. Tony tells Lucy that pig threw an iron at Pa, practically broke his back. Lucy says, "What? No, that can't be." Edison, seeing that Tony is very heated and is not going to leave without a fight, decides to raise his arms out, and he says, "You want payback for what I did to your old man? Fine, free shot. Take it with the bottle, but if I'm standing when you're done, I'm hitting back." Tony, he tries to get in closer to Edison as he has a cracked glass bottle in his hand, ready for swinging. Tony, he's expecting to get a free shot in, but Edison was just lying and punches Tony right in the face, and Tony goes down. Edison tells Tony's friends to get this chump home. Once they all scurry off, Lucy asks Edison, "You said he would get a free shot at you." Edison replies, "I'm not that dumb." Lucy asks if the stuff that Tony accused Edison of is true, how he threw the iron at his dad. Edison begrudgingly admits it was true. Lucy asks, "Why? How could you? You said you became a cop to help people." Edison replies, a little bit heated, "You want to know how Oriental cops help? By pretending they're someone they're not. By sneaking into Oriental opium and gambling dens. By snitching. That's the cost of helping, being a rat." Lucy asks Edison if he really even knew Wilbur Manalo, the mutual friend of hers that connected them together. Edison answers, yeah. He'd talk about San Francisco a lot when he was blue. I was the one that arrested him. Lucy, she slaps Edison in the face. She's upset, she's crying. All day she's been trying her hardest to help Edison, and Edison is not as genuine as he claimed to be. Lucy, she storms off. Edison, he goes back to his apartment and he develops the pictures that were on that film roll that he received in the envelope from Helen Chow, the sister of Holly Chow, who was best friends with Ivy Chen. And one of the photographs is a picture of the lawyer and businessman Terrence Chang. Terrence, Chinatown's great yellow hope, engaged in a homosexual sex act with a man. This is very scandalous, especially in the 1930s, as homosexual acts like this were not only looked down upon by a lot of people, but they were also illegal. This photograph, in combination with the envelope full of money, leads us to believe that this photo was used for blackmail purposes, and the money were the fruits of that blackmail. Issue 4. Edison Hark is in his apartment. He's having sex with a prostitute. It is actually the white woman that he was eyeing back on the street in issue 1, the one he saw outside of the police raid. Well, once the two of them are done, they are lying in bed with one another and talking. The girl asks Edison, "So who's Victoria?" Edison must have said his sister's name at some point during their intercourse. Edison, he gets defensive at the question, and his mood grows sour. The girl asks, "Christ's sake, fella, don't get shy now. I'm guessing it ain't the first time you said that during a blanket party. I mean, I had you pegged when I saw ya. Uptight, looking to explode? God, you slants love us Americans, huh? Was it the skin, the hair, the..." Edison cuts in and tells her, the unnecessarily round eyes, "Look, the cash is on the dresser. I'll be back in a second." Edison, he goes to take a shower down the hall, and he thinks on what his sister Victoria was telling him just a few nights ago, how Ivy Chen's disappearance might be due to their father Mason's secrets. Edison thinks about his brother Frankie and wonders how much Frankie really knows. Edison, he returns to his room wearing a towel after his shower. And the girl he was with, she is running a little bit of a racket. She invited two tough guy acquaintances of her to hide in the room and beat Edison up when he came back and rob him. The two tough guys have knives and they threaten Edison, and they tell him, "Before you start hollering, ask yourself who the cops are helping, you or us, some real Americans." Edison, deciding what to do, figures he has to fight. He takes off his towel and throws it at the attackers, and Edison, naked, fights the two men. He grabs one of the men and slams their head into a mirror. Edison then grabs a belt, and he whips the other one, managing to get the buckle in the attacker's eye. Edison, he then starts strangling the man with the belt, and then he smashes the guy through a chair in the room, breaking it, and both attackers are then subdued. Edison tells the girl to get her bruisers out of here to a doctor now. He's got an early morning. In the morning, Edison meets up with his brother Frankie, who is goofing around, holding Edison's badge and doing a cop impression. Frankie's saying, "Why don't you answer some simple questions?" The two of them are working together this day to try and get some leads on Ivy Chen's disappearance. They are asking various people various questions. Eventually, they start theorizing what maybe is happening. So Ivy Chen's best friend Holly, who is dead now, was hiding blackmail money and a picture of Terrence Chang engaged in a homosexual sex act. Ivy supposedly said that Hui Long was her father. Maybe Terrence Chang killed Holly and is responsible for Ivy's disappearance. And if Hui Long is really Ivy's dad, well, maybe he was trying to get revenge on Terrence and trying to kill him. They're not sure, though. It's not all quite making sense. Either way, though, they want to question Terrence Chang, but he has gone into hiding ever since the attempt on his life at the Jade Castle, and he is nowhere to be found. Edison and Frankie, they are traveling to a few places around town trying to find him, or find someone who might know his whereabouts. After trying a few places and getting nowhere, Frankie and Edison, while they are driving to their next location, have a serious conversation. Frankie mentions something from their childhood, a night where Edison and Mason had an argument. He says, "When we were kids, you two fought and he hit you, and then we never saw you again. Father was so sorry, he wrote you every 2 weeks like clockwork for 10 years. Edison replies, "I wrote back." Frankie continues, "You wrote back? You should have been here. We were supposed to be brothers." Edison says, "We are." Frankie continues, "Are we? When we were kids, you told me everything. But then we grew up and you iced us out. Like, we weren't family anymore. I mean, why'd it take a heart attack for you to see us, huh? Why? How the hell did you get so good at it anyway, not feeling anything? No matter who you hurt. Father took you in after your mother died and you used him for his money and walked away." Edison, he gets angry. He slams the brakes and he says, "Screw this. Did you sleep with Ivy Chen?" Frankie, surprised at his brother's accusation, denies it. Edison tells him not to lie. "You remember where she grew up, her habits, you were smitten with her." Frankie, sad, admits, "Fine. It was just a kiss, I was drunk." Edison replies, "Christ, you knew how your father felt for her and you kissed her?" Frankie, feeling guilty, says, "Don't you think I know that? Don't you think? It was just a kiss, and she pushed me away, and we promised that we'd never... Anyway, and then she was gone. Don't you think it'd be easier for me if she stayed missing? But she has to come back. If she's back, even if she tells him, even if he hates me, at least he'll be alright, and I won't wake up feeling like this. I just have to do one thing right." The two of them, after their conversation wraps up, continue on with their journey that night. The two of them drive over to the Jade Castle in their search for Terrence. They figure that Donnie Yan, the brother of the now dead Benny Yan, might know the location of Terrence. They try the buzzer on the Jade Castle back door, but there is no answer. Frankie says that Donnie has been at the Jade Castle every night since the death of his brother. He must be inside. Now, the Jade Castle is closed right now, but they figure that Donnie must still be in there. So the two, they sneak into the closed-down nightclub. Inside, they find Donnie Yan dead, sitting in a chair in the middle of the room. He has a hatchet in his chest, and one of his eyes is missing. This must be the work of Hui Long. But why just one eye? Hui Long has been taking 2 eyes in the past. The reason Hui Long only took 1 eye is because Frankie and Edison just interrupted him. Hui Long was in the room, removing the eye when they came in, so he tried to hide. And now Hui Long, he begins trying to run out of there. He is booking it for the door to head out onto the street. Edison chases after him and manages to catch Hui Long outside the building, and he tackles him outside. Hui Long, though, is a skilled fighter, and he knees Edison in the head, and Edison falls down. And Hui Long, he is wearing a mask still. He is covering his appearance, and he is standing above Edison, and he has another hatchet in his hand. He is going to kill Edison, but Frankie, he runs up behind this Hui Long. He jumps on him, and he grabs at his mask, and he manages to rip the mask off. And he exposes this mysterious Hui Long as Some white guy! Not who we expected, and clearly not some Chinese Tong gang member. Frankie comments puzzled, "What? But you're not Chinese." The revealed man uses his hatchet and he slices at Frankie's throat. And Frankie drops to his knees and he is trying to stop the blood from pouring out. And the mysterious Hui Long attacker runs off. Edison grabs Frankie and tries to help him. Frankie is just yelling, "Don't let him get away!" Edison is telling his brother to be quiet. Try not to talk. "You're dead if I don't stop the bleeding." Frankie just says to not let the man get away and to just let me die. He can't get away because of me. Let me do one thing right. And eventually, Frankie dies from the blood loss. Edison, standing above his brother's dead body, begins to narrate. The last thing he hears is me promising it'll be okay. I'll make sure no one else will get hurt. Another lie. Because that's what Edison Hark does. Because while America's eyes are fixed on Chinatown, an American millionaire just got killed on its streets. Soon this alley will be teeming with sirens and city bulls, and when they spot his body, God knows if there'll be Chinatowns in America come the morning. And with that cliffhanger, we end Volume 1 of The Good Asian. Alright, so that was The Good Asian Volume 1. I hope you all enjoyed this opening chapter. Next week, I will be back with the conclusion in Volume 2, and then I will be on to a new book after that. But yeah, I really enjoyed this opening volume. I really like the artwork and the crime noir vibe and feel of everything. I also like that this story is kind of from a unique perspective of Chinese Americans in the 1930s, and I like some of that history that we're exploring. I'm also engaged in the overall story for now. I want to see where it's all going to go. What is going to be the repercussions of this Frankie Carraway's death? And what will Edison learn and find out in Volume 2? And also what happened with this Ivy Chen? So yeah, I thought this was a great opening. I'm going to give this one an 8 out of 10. Thank you all for watching, and I'll be back next week with the conclusion.